Hello and welcome to the Transport Leaders podcast, where two grumpy old men demonstrate their grumpiness. G'day and welcome to the Transport Leaders podcast. I'm Graham McCabe. I'm a transport planner and traffic engineer with 30 years experience. And joining me today is my fellow grumpy old man, Russell King.
I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist with about 20 years experience in transport policy, and I'm the writer and founder of the Transport Leader newsletter and blog.
But not a grumpy old man today.
I am a grumpy old man, and I think today we will be grumpy old men disagreeing with each other. It will be an interesting one.
Okay, Russell. Okay, all right. Let's jump straight into it. So what are we going to talk about?
Today, Graham, we're going to talk about whether we should be listening to experts or vested interests and when making our decisions, which I think is going to be a very interesting topic with a lot of people don't quite understand. And I suspect you and I will disagree on this one. So I think it's going to be fun.
Well, okay. All right. So let's start off with some definitions. Let's see if we agree at the start about what we mean by vested interests.
Okay. So I think a vested interest is someone that has some sort of material benefit from a decision being made or being considered, and so they have an interest in that decision that goes beyond a purely a decision based without them having a neutral perspective.
Okay. So we're including stakeholders, people who are affected by decisions, people who make money out of decisions. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so...
Anything you disagree with on that?
Well, okay, so lobby groups, obviously they have different types of lobby groups. So you have lobby groups who are genuine believers in things. So, in the Anglo context, I very much think light rail cycling, they have lobby groups of people who really want those things. But then you also have different types of lobby groups where the people who make money off those things being constructed. A person who's concerned over the loss of car parking out the front of their house, different to the funded interests who are spreading propaganda saying they're going to take away your right to own a car so they can put in a public transport. So I'm thinking let's talk about the moneyed interest rather than the possibly poorly informed member of the public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's focus on the moneyed interest. I'm happy to do that. I think you're right. There is a spectrum here of vested interests. It's not a one size fits all. So I think that's a good point. So that's vested interests. Yeah. What do we mean by experts?
Well, so experts.
Do you consider yourself an expert? Let's start with that.
I consider myself an expert in some things, but they are not in all things. So I'm not an expert in public policy. I'm not an expert in stakeholder communications. I'm highly experienced in the latter, but that's within the framework of the practice that I perform. So, but in many aspects of transport, I would consider myself. So, before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I think that, the Dunning-Kruger effect, I'm at the point of knowing what I don't know in my area, and I probably fall into I think I know, but I don't actually know in lots of other areas.
Yeah. So, and then in terms of an expert, are we talking about someone who knows enough to know what they don't know in an area? Is that kind of where we're getting close to in terms of what an expert is?
You would have people who would be considered experts before and that. So there'll be lots of people who are saying they're an expert in a topic who are putting across that expertise as being the catch-all for everything that they're talking about.
Yeah, so let me tease out the expert stuff because I think it's a really interesting thing. So I think it's really important in terms of how we do make decisions. Somebody who has recently graduated in some sort of transport discipline, could be transport planning, could be engineering. Are they an expert?
No, most definitely not.
Okay, so that's a graduate.
Yeah.
Well, now what about someone who's a postgraduate, so a postdoc? So they're a PhD, they've done a research topic in, I don't know, the benefits of light rail, in, southern hemisphere cities or something. Would they be an expert in that topic?
In the benefits of light rail in southern hemisphere cities, it doesn't make them a transportation expert. So
no. But in that specific area, in that niche, they would be, yeah?
in
Fair?
that singular topic. Yeah. So the difference between many years of practice and having a doctorate is your doctorate actually funnels you down into a very narrow thing, gets rid of all the broadness. And it's like, you are this singular topic, which is the title of your PhD. You should be the top person, one of the top people in the world for.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting then is... Yeah, so take somebody who's just joined a transport agency, and let's assume that they're a PhD, so they've got their doctorate, but they're working in an area which is adjacent but not specifically their niche. At that point, they're probably not an expert in that space. How many years experience do they need before they become an expert? I mean, it's kind of like how long's a piece of string, right? But is there a threshold where you go, now you're an expert?
Well, I would, at the extreme end where if you're being recognized by a court as being an expert in a topic, that's so in a lot of traffic engineering and road safety things, there's, being recognized by the court as being an expert, which is usually, a peer-based assessment where you've already gone through some form of professional recognition. So you might be a fellow or chartered of a professional association.
Yeah, so there's a credentialized thing here as well, which is an aspect of it. Although I think one of the things is that we overly rely on credentials to provide a sort of certificate of quality on people, and I think that often that's not necessarily valid. But yes, I broadly agree with you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's talk about why this is important.
Yeah.
Right.
So So when not just in transport, but anytime where somebody can make money out of something, they will they will end up pushing a particular, regardless of whether it's their intention.
Okay, so
so to give you a real life, example, which is fundamentally going on at the moment, is the speed and quantity of electric vehicle chargers in the public domain. So you listen to the people who manufacture electric vehicle chargers or can make money from electric vehicle chargers being the public domain. They will tell you that there is not nearly enough everywhere in the world. Now, there's only one country which has 90+% new car EV penetration, and that's Norway. And Australia is actually quite close in terms of the proportions to Norway.
Just make sure we clear a definition on this. Yes.
Yeah.
Number of chargers per capita?
Per EV.
Per EV. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So you go, okay, well, we scale proportionally as we grow the EV market. But there are people out there saying, no, we need even more than that. And we need a lot more than that. And we need them now. And we need government to pay for them.
Okay. I don't want to get down. I'm sure they'll have other things to come back with, and I don't want to get down the rabbit hole of whether that's right or wrong. Okay?
No, because there's
what you're trying to do
interest.
Right, but you want to get into the principle that there's a way that people here are distorting the truth in order to provide because they have a monetary interest. Whether this is an example of the case or not, but that's the concept, right? So the standard concept in a lot of our decision-making processes is that the theory goes the decision maker, so typically the politician, when making policy, will initiate a process of consultation to all stakeholders, many of whom could be vested interests, okay? And the experts will come up, will take that stakeholder input into account, and they will provide their expert advice to the decision maker, and the decision maker will weigh up that expert advice and the stakeholder, thinking, and make a decision off the back of it. That's kind of the theory for the Westminster system, okay? And not just the Westminster system, it's true in the US as well. Basically, that's kind of like how we structure our sort of political decision making. The politicians are not typically experts in a field, and so what they're supposed to do is listen to the advice from the experts with stakeholder input from it, take it into account, and then make a good quality decision. So that's the kind of the theory.
Yeah. So what happens when the politicians blame the expert rather than taking the accountability? Which I think we've seen quite a bit lately, particularly in areas outside of transport. but also within transport.
Yeah. Okay. So
the
I'm going to give
UK Prime Minister is a very good case in.
Yes. So I remember, I'm going to give a personal anecdote on this one, because I have been in that situation where I've been a politician, okay, and a decision that I signed off on has gone Pete Tong, okay? So it was basically around
Has gone what?
Pete Tong wrong. Okay, sorry,
Right.
a bit of Cockney rhyming slang there. Okay. Anyway, it effectively it was kind of a change of configuration of a stretch of road, and the public servants had sort of just sent it up to me to have a look at. They said we've done the assessments, etc. Blah 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 blah. Right, and the residents were absolutely up in arms about it. Okay, and we were at a public meeting, and because of the nature of the way the public meeting was, the public servants were defending the position, okay, and the residents were getting extremely upset on what the position that was done. And in my case, what I did was I just basically said, look, this is my fault. I signed off on the piece and took responsibility for it, because ultimately I did sign off on it, okay, and apologized to the residents for the problems that it caused, etc., and made it very clear that it was nowhere, and the public servants had done a very good job and thoroughly, but in this case it hadn't worked, right? And so I took accountability. It completely diffused the situation from two perspectives. One is the residents really appreciated the apology and recognizing that they had felt their pain, right? But the second thing, which was really important, was that the public servants knew that I took accountability for it. Yeah. And so they knew that, at the end of the day, when there was things that were difficult, which were my call, they knew that I wouldn't duck it, right? And that I would take accountability for it. And what that meant was I got much better advice moving forward and support, because they knew that if something was going wrong, okay, I would ultimately have their back for it, because I would take accountability and responsibility for it. And it made it, and it helped a lot. So yes, I know exactly what you mean. And my advice to decision makers on this is just stand up and be counted. In the vast majority of cases, it's not as bad as you think it is, by admitting that sometimes things go wrong, even if it's not your fault, like directly.
Yeah, you continue the story if you deny, obfuscate, or blame, and they still end up having to resign anyway.
And most of the situations is not the cover-up's worse than the crime. Yeah, most of the time.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah, most of the time you just got to say, we got this wrong. This is why it happened. Very sorry about that. We try to do better next time. And the vast majority of the time, people accept that. And I mean, sometimes it's absolutely horrific, and it is going to be a resignation affair, right? In which case, you just need to bite the bullet and accept that that's the role, that's the job, okay? Because then otherwise, you just bleed pain. The government bleeds pain, and you end up having to be forced to resign ultimately, anyway. But anyway, that's a slightly different point, okay?
Yeah. Well, but I think it's not, because I mean, we're talking about how decision makers are influenced, and who they choose to listen to for their advice. So, it's not very often that ministers, secretaries of state are going to a bunch of professors and saying, "Can you give us advice on this thing?" And then actually listening to them and doing the thing.
Okay, let's tease out some of the issues here. Having been in the situation both as an ex-politician and an advisor and an expert as well, I would argue, maybe in some areas. All right, so we talked about the theory of the decision making. So problem number one that I've seen, okay, I know one minister who was an expert and knew far more in transport, and we've talked about this problem before, against the senior leaders of the transport agency who were all generalists. Right? And so the ministers...
I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about.
Right? And so it's like, but isn't this going to create induced demand, on a particular policy position? And they went effectively like, what do you mean by induced demand? And you're like, hold on, you're the senior leaders of the transport organisation. You're supposed to be the experts. I'm not supposed to be educating you as the minister on what induced demand is, right? So problem number one with the theory is sometimes you have a minister who knows a lot in a space. So they genuinely have an opinion because they have come with a lot of space. And then second problem is that sometimes your experts are not actually experts. They're actually just generalists who are wearing an expert hat but aren't actually experts. And so that's a real problem there. So that's an example of where the theory breaks down in practice.
Are they just administrators who are then not relying on their expertise?
Well, yes, their expertise is in a different area, right? Their expertise is in, I'll be generous and say leadership, often not particularly expert in that either. But, that's the concept, but they don't understand. They're the wrong people to be advising the minister because they don't understand actually how transport works, because they're generalists. But the problem is because they're in the senior role, they're in the chair, if you like, of that senior position, they feel like they have to provide the advice, whereas actually, really, what you need is someone from their team who is an expert providing advice, who actually understands it. The problem is they're always signing off on that advice, and if they don't understand it, how can they sign off on it? So you just end up with a mess in terms of the advice that comes into a minister. Problem number one.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So, ministerial Secretary of State briefing notes, they're generally, one page. Here's the problem, here's the thing, here's how much it's going to cost, here's the politics from their advisors, and then you have a whole heap of attachments. So these days, how much are those senior administrative officials bringing the experts along to the briefing? So you get 15 minutes with the minister, or maybe an hour if you're lucky. Let's talk about that a little bit.
So I think the problem here is it's really dependent on the nature of the leadership of the people. So sometimes you've got fantastic public service leaders who are all about developing their people. They're long-time public servants. They recognize themselves, 20 years ago in the people that are coming up through the ranks, and they have they are a believer in building the capabilities and competency of the public service. Okay. And so they will bring relatively inexperienced people in to, brief the minister on an area where they're in expertise. They will still be there, but, they're helping them to sort of develop their skills and develop their competencies, as well as providing expert advice, high quality advice to the minister or the Secretary of State or whatever. All right. So that's kind of one school. The problem is that increasingly we've had relatively transient people into public service roles, and they may take a very different position. They have much less, passion for the public service as a long-term, career option, because they've, moved around different functions and sections, okay? And they may feel less secure as well if they're a generalist in terms of having someone who knows a lot more than them, who's a lot junior to them, almost making them look bad from their perspective if they're thinking about it, because they feel like they have to be the expert, because they don't have the confidence to go, I'm not the expert in this field, I'm a generalist. Here's the person who needs to advise you, minister. So that's a problem as well. So I think that you can end up with a lot of the latter, whereas what you really want is the former.
Yeah. Okay. So minister gets the briefing from their agency. Then they go off to, a dinner or a fundraiser, and the tunneling guy comes up and goes, "Hey, high-speed rail, it's really good. Do a 60-kilometer long tunnel, lots of jobs."
You're being so harsh on them, and I think you're being too harsh, to be fair. Like, you and I both agree on high-speed rail being a poor use of our money, but
yeah. So how do they really do it? How do the lobbyists really do it? Yeah.
I would say with high-speed rail is not.
In general, how do the lobbyists do it?
Okay, so I'm just going to put this down. I have worked for a peak body here. I've been in charge of policy for a peak body in urban planning and transport space, sort of, right? So yes, so I've been there. So there are different schools of thought, right? So I'll give you an example of where it influenced a decision. A decision had been made on a policy which was extremely bad for the industry I was working for. So urban developers, in this case. Okay. But the way the policy had been done was extremely poor, and they hadn't really understood. They hadn't done the modelling on what the impact of the policy would be. So it was very much a question of vibes before evidence and research. So in that case, what I said was, I spoke to the person in the minister's office, and I just said, look, I'm not asking for anything radical. I'm asking for you to go and do your homework properly. Go and get an assessment of the impact on this from, some recognized consultants who understand this position, right? And get them to assess the impact, because you haven't done that impact assessment yet, which is basic policy 101. And I can talk about why they didn't do the basic policy 101. It wasn't to do with politics or anything. It was to do with a lack of strategic policy capability within the public service. But that's all I asked was just do the research. And then a few weeks later, I got a phone call from the minister's office saying, the research has come back. It's devastating. We're thinking we're going to have to completely U-turn on the policy. Help, what do I do? Kind of thing. That was a good example of where actually the role sometimes of those vested interests is to make sure the process is properly followed, because often policymaking is not what it should be. Okay.
So that's a good example of
That's a good example of why it's
vested
actually really important to listen to vested interests and not just basically say we're going to close them down and never listen to them. Okay. They do provide an important voice that you need to listen to. Now, you may disagree with them, and that's fine, right? That's an important point. But just saying, oh, they're moneyed vested interest, therefore we should completely ignore them, is not the answer either, right? You need to listen to what they're saying and decide whether or not it's good or not.
Yeah, and continuing the disclosure, I'm a member of three lobby groups.
Yeah.
So
at the other end of the spectrum, okay, there is a group which will say, our members have lots of money, and if you continue with this policy, we will run a campaign against you, okay, attacking this policy. And you will suffer massively as a result of this policy. And this campaign will say X, Y, and Z. Now, often that X, Y, and Z is what people already believe partially, okay, and that the government is trying to explain to people that doesn't make sense. So I would give you an example in the transport space. It might be, we're moving away from building more roads, right? You could see a scenario where people who are vested interests in road building would say, right, we're going to run a campaign saying this just means a lot more congestion and making your life misery, etc., and attacking the government in that perspective. Which to some extent is what's happened for ministers that have changed direction from building more roads to investing more in public and active transport.
Yeah, or amplifying conspiracy theories about the whole 15-minute concept thing. So we probably don't have time to get too far into the role of dark money in helping sustain anti-non-car measures, which is, I think I've just done some double negatives, but anyway. But yes, there are. Yeah, you only have to look at lots of different things at the moment to see dark money being used to push to support beliefs and amplify the negatives.
Yeah, there's other things as well in here, which are funding politicians' electoral campaigns. Okay, it's a particular challenge in the United States where it's considered a part of freedom of speech to be able to effectively fund politicians' re-election campaigns, where the money involved is massive, and therefore is extremely valuable to politicians. And so what you end up with is basically politicians being bought by vested interest groups in order to vote down legislation that's against that vested interest, even if it's even if they know it's against the public, they're looking to do it. And if you ever read John Carroll's biographies of Lyndon B. Johnson, you will see examples of that, which and I would say that this is a very common thing amongst politicians, is that he faced that sort of dilemma of, do I go against what I believe in order for the funding to do because that will help my career, or do I do what I think is the right thing to do? And he chose to compromise on his values in order to retain his career. Now, he was a brilliant politician in many, many, many ways, but I don't think many people would argue that he was a saint by any stretch of the imagination. Right. And that's a common challenge for politicians, whether it's coming from, if you're on the left, trade union demands, for example. Trade unions have got a lot of power over MPs in the Labour Party and their ability to get reselected and those sorts of things. And that can be a significant challenge. But also it can be a challenge for in other political parties as well, but from different vested interest groups. So you've got all of that playing into this space as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's have a chat about experts with vested interests. And I can think of a few that I know. So you'll have experts who think that their form of transport, and particularly when we're talking the public transport space, the form where they get a lot of their research funding from, being overly favourable and thinking that their form of transport that they work in is the best. How do we deal with the, say, a train versus a bus versus a cycling versus a light rail, expertise? How does
you've missed one massive one.
Yeah.
Right.
Metros?
No, you missed an even bigger one.
Right. Yeah.
Roads.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the massive challenges in the expert space, and I use inverted commas on expert here, is that many departments of transport around the world have grown up building roads and building and widening roads. Okay.
Yeah.
And they have lots of people whose expertise is in building and widening roads. Okay. And funnily enough, their advice tends to be, as experts, is build more and widen roads. Well, what a surprise, right? Because their whole career is based around that. Okay. And so their future career, their ongoing existence is based around building and widening more roads. So if you're a transport agency, so if you're somebody who's looking to change that, you are directly impacting them and directly impacting them financially as well. So I would argue in those cases, they are both an expert and a vested interest. Okay. And they don't use money in the same way to get, or threatens in terms of ministers. They do it through the advice they provide and through distorting the decision-making process in other ways, right? So they will commission their business case in a way that plays down the unintended consequences of, road building in order to, benefit the road. One thing that's very common at the moment is you see a road project with a cycle lane attached to it. The business case for the road is less than one, i.e. it's not justified. But the active transport element of it has significantly more than one, and so is what gets the project over the line in terms of benefit cost ratio of over one. It's that sort of distortion that is we're currently seeing.
Yeah. Yes. So I was thinking more in the competition for the non-road dollar, where you have the bus expert and the cycling expert and the rail expert, or so typical. Distraction, delay, denial from the roads lobby is to get everybody else fighting amongst themselves so that the roads keep their 97% of the funding pot.
Yes. So this is an interesting challenge, right? And I think it goes back to our first principles pace about how we decide which things to do with the strategic business case, right? So when we talk about strategic business case, you're supposed to be defining your problem and at that point being mode neutral, right? You are supposed to be thinking about how do you best solve the problem, okay? And of course, in the transport space, we often bypass that for various reasons. And it's like, we're building a road or we're building a light rail or whatever it is, often because it's been driven for, say, political reasons off the back of a manifesto promise, or because a part of the agency has said, this is a problem, this is our solution, and has got the politician over the line before bypassing the strategic planning thinking.
Or the external vested interests. So, I think of, town bypasses. So, town bypasses can be good because they may take heavy vehicles out of a town, improving safety and amenity within the town. But they can also be bad because they're financially unsustainable in a lot of cases and do lots of environmental damage. So I think of, we do talk a lot about New South Wales on the north coast of New South Wales. Rather than doing a bunch of small town bypasses on the Pacific Highway, they did one massive bypass which went through the centre of a national park and bypassed a whole heap of population centres. And think of a railway that might be doing a similar thing.
Okay, let's not go there. Right. Okay. So there is there's disagreements with experts around modes. Okay, which mode is the right mode to solve a problem? So that's a sheer challenge. I've also seen it where experts within a mode have a disagreement over what the right answer is. So, and so I've seen, for example, disagreements about the strategy for purchasing new rail fleet, okay, and disagreements about that from the experts. Okay, so what do you want if you're a minister, what is the best thing to have on that? So I think either, the department has to come to a decision about what its advice is, or it has to say, Minister, we have differences of opinions here, and you lay out the cases honestly for both perspectives, and you allow the decision maker to make a decision. So I've seen that as well. There were some decisions we were making over the configuration of new trains, for example, and there was genuine splits. The evidence was kind of 50-50 both ways. People had different views across the agency. It was like,
you better not be responsible for the non-reversible seats on the trains between Wollongong and Sydney. Right. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's an example of differences of opinion of, comfort versus amenity.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And somebody made a decision that USB chargers were more important than people not getting motion sick. But anyway.
Well, it was, the research showed that, 50% of people preferred more and 50% preferred another option. What do you do?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
you make a decision, don't you? And in
Yeah.
terms of that,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
think
Okay. All
it's
right. So, go on.
go on. All right. So the question for me, the problem I think here
Yeah.
is, in many cases, right, and we can talk about high-speed rail here, the difference between experts and vested interests is non-existent in the sense of these people are wearing two hats. They are experts, so we've got plenty of experts in high-speed rail, but they're also going to get work and significant amounts of it from a high-speed rail project. So it is in their interests vested interests, to promote a high-speed rail project. Right. And the problem with, I think, in our transport space at the moment is, and this is because the government overwhelmingly dominates the funding for transport, very little comes from the private sector. It's overwhelmingly government money. Okay. Everyone is reliant on government money, or the vast majority of the organizations are very reliant on government money. That's true of the consultancies. It's true of the engineering companies. It's true of the academics as well. A lot of their funding comes from government sources as well. So everyone is on the government payroll. These are all the experts, of course. They all have a vested interest, right? So who is it that's going to be saying, from an expert perspective, and saying, this is a dud project? Okay. And at the moment, so our independent assessors, Infrastructure Australia, who did a very good job on, critiquing the high-speed rail business case, but still had to, not truly independent either, right? Because
they're appointed by the infrastructure minister.
Indeed, right? So they've got a challenge there. So you add up all of that. There is no one saying, that this is a bad project because everyone's on government payroll, right? So once, in this case, the Prime Minister has decided that this is a good project, even though all the evidence stacks up against it, there's a whole bunch of people who are experts supporting it. So it's a real problem. And people, even if they know that privately they disagree with the project, publicly they can't say that because they are reliant on government funding. That is a significant, and that's one of the problems structurally I think we have in the transport sector, is because we're so reliant on government funding, we don't say this is not a good project.
It's kind of interesting because if you use LinkedIn as the metric for experts' views, it's been surprisingly quiet aside from companies. So companies and the beneficiaries, as opposed to the experts, have been the ones that have been most loudly in favour of it, rather than experts saying this is a really good project. There's been a lot of silence.
I think the problem, LinkedIn has its strengths. There's some people out there who really hate LinkedIn, people who are big X users or something like that, because they're kind of like everything is sanitized and, is, corporatized, right, for it. And that is one of the challenges on LinkedIn. I don't think it's a good judgment of what people think in terms of, what experts think or that they don't think. I think.
Well, that's why I'm saying that the silence is the noticeable bit.
But people don't, like, LinkedIn is not used for disagreeing on things anyway, whether it's transport or other things, right? It tends to be very much a kind of glass is half full, positive thinking kind of platform, which I think is why it gets critiqued so heavily by people on X, where the glass is always half empty and it's normally conspiracy theory. Right. So,
well, isn't that the whole point of our episode? It's all one big conspiracy theory from
indeed,
people with money or want to make money.
I think that's why it's not a reflection on necessarily of their thoughts. It's just a reflection of people don't put stuff that is controversial on LinkedIn, full stop, if it's a project they're interested in or not.
Yeah.
LinkedIn.
How do we find out what the experts really think? If, do we go to the conversation? Do we call them up to Senate estimates or, government oversight committee in the US and get the experts?
The problem here is that you're assuming that experts all agree and that they're right. Okay.
No, that's what I'm saying is, we get them under oath.
Well, but the problem is, even under oath, that you're assuming that they're all going to agree. They won't, right? You will get different opinions. So one of the classics for governments is you quote the experts who agree with you, right? You ignore the experts who disagree with you, right? And it can work for anything. In the world of economics, 99.9% of economists will tell you that, freezing rents is a disastrous policy, okay, and will make housing shortages worse and create more homelessness. Right? 99.9% of economists will tell you that, right? But guess who they'll quote if the government has decided that capping rents is the right policy? They'll do the other 0.1%. And they'll come up with three people who are professor so and so, with whatever, and who has an ideological perspective that this is rent control is a good thing, and they'll do that.
Yeah.
And it's true in any space, right? So you've got that challenge, right?
I think getting back to our space, it's the economists are telling governments to stop spending so much money on infrastructure because it's stopping housing from being built, and it's also pushing up inflation and causing interest rates. And then governments go, but cutting ribbons is good.
Well, the other thing I would say in our space is a lot of the economists believe in building roads, right? Because they don't understand induced demand at all. And their models are based around, well, if there's no road, it's not productive. But if you build a road, it's productive, okay? Without understanding that the economics within an urban environment are completely different.
Yeah.
And productivity is completely different if you're trying to ram through a whole bunch of cars into a very limited geographical space. Non-transport economists, so the generic economists you get in treasury departments typically, won't understand.
But supply-demand curves and elasticities, which are the thing that create the induced demand, are part of, is basic economics training, isn't it? I saw I did study that in my one economics subject in my master's degree.
For whatever, let's be frank about it, right? The induced demand wasn't incorporated into business cases until relatively recently, right? And it's still a bit patchy. So, right? So it's not as though we are incorporating these things in, and that guidance comes from Treasury, right? For defining business cases typically in places, whether it's the Green Book in the UK or other models.
Yeah.
Right.
So I do recall, when I first started out in my career, our cost-benefit analysis for projects basically had two things in it: travel time savings and crash risk.
Yeah, right. So it's it's got more sophisticated and it's getting better.
Yeah.
But it's also, as we've talked about in our business case episode, see below, are we getting overly complex now, and to the point where we're losing the value of the business case because it takes so long and it costs so much? Whereas it's kind of like we could get to better decision making. But check out our episode on business cases. Now,
so do we have expertise paralysis and analysis paralysis? So you're studying things to death, getting lots of experts to work on them. So to give an example, a set of motorway ramps, going back to roads, just got announced. This set of ramps had been planned for 30 years, and then they spent 2 years coming back to the decision that, yes, the original location, which all the access roads had been designed around, and all the housing growth had been designed around, was the right location.
The question is, why did they have to redo the work? So one possibility is it's great for creating work for your department and doing it that way. That would kind of be the cynical view. There's another problem, which is if that original business case work had gone to cabinet of a former government, it cannot be shared with the current government. Even though there's nothing politically necessarily sensitive in it, it cannot be shared with the current government. So you're then asking the current government to make a decision without being given the information, which is ridiculous, right? So part of the problem here is also the governance, in the sense of that sort of information should not be cabinet, privileged from previous governments. You shouldn't have to duplicate the work of a previous government on something that is not, for me, in a technical study.
Yeah, let's dive in. This is a sidetrack. Let's dive into this a little bit, because this is, a set of motorway ramps which was allowed for 40 years ago. So when the motorway was built, the land for the ramps was set aside, and all of the connecting roads were set up for new housing areas for these ramps. And so the original approval for the motorway, which went through an environmental impact assessment, etc., but the underlying work was cabinet in confidence. Therefore, you can't just say, well, we already decided this was a good spot. Let's just do the detail on the environmental assessment for the ramps, rather than having to go all the way back to the start of, is this an appropriate location?
So, okay. So if you're a say you're the senior public servant who's got this thing is on their table, right? Is on the table, right?
Yeah.
You have two choices in a way. You go and sit down with the minister and you say to the minister, this decision was made 40 years ago. I can't provide you with any of the information because it's because of cabinet rules. Okay. But this was the theory. This was the theory. This is the logic. This is the, this was this. And that's why we've got to where we got to. So the EIS was done. I can't share it with you. It's went to cabinet, right? All the rest of it. Okay. Our view still is, right, as an independent or quasi-independent, advice agency, okay, neutral of the particular colour of the government of the day, is that this is still the right position and we should proceed, okay? The alternative for us, Minister, is that we go away and spend 2 years and several $1 million doing another study to prove that that's the case. So your option is you go to the Minister and you lay it out, right? I think most public servants won't have that discussion now because I don't think they'll just default to doing the study.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Well, and would the ministers have that level of trust in the public servants to go?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's part of it, right? It's like, it's how trusted is this public servant with the minister and how good is their relationship, right? So if you've got a really good relationship with the minister, you can just say to the minister, look, Minister, this is the situation. I can waste several $1 million of taxpayers' money revisiting this thing. Okay. Or we just go or you just accept that, you won't be able to see the detail of the advice, but the answer will be the same, Minister, based on my expert opinion. Okay. Or based on my expert's opinion, if it's somebody else's opinion, right? Say, our expert advice is you will get the same answer. Let's not waste the millions doing the study.
And a lot of the work still has to be redone anyway, because that other work is, there'll be all types of things in the environmental assessments that weren't required at the time that now would. So,
especially if it's 40 years ago,
yeah. So if you're, hopefully that preliminary work that's being done in order to produce a report for the current minister can be reused through the environmental assessment process. So probably won't be. It probably still get redone. So you end up with all the same reports being done twice. Well, three times or 2 times in the modern context and an additional once in the historical. Yeah. So that's a really interesting thing to know, that going back to the Westminster system of government where everything basically is off the table from what previous governments' decisions have been made, that it does result in a lot of rework.
Yeah, right. So it's another weakness of the system. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of good reasons why a lot of information should be cabinet confidential, okay, and shouldn't be given to the future government. But I think the one-size-fits-all policy on that is wrong, and there should be a process for assessing what should remain unavailable to a future government and what should be available to a future government. And I think technical studies should be something that generally should be available to a future government rather than having to be redone.
So speaking of vested interests, we have the political vested interest of things being wrapped up in cabinet in confidence that shouldn't be, because elected governments don't want discussion of things they're investigating. So a lot of those preliminary studies these days are cabinet in confidence because they're going to feed a cabinet decision, so therefore they can't be.
The reason you have the rule effectively at the moment, I think, is a technical study comes up with the answer being X and the politicians don't like it, so they want to go with Y. So you don't want to have a report that is subject to a freedom of information request that basically says the decision the minister made was not supported by the evidence, because that's a scandal, in effect. Not a scandal, but it's a way of attacking the government. Or the expert said this and you did this instead, Minister. It's not the conversation you want to be having as a government, right? And so the way that you avoid that is you prevent it from being freedom of information access by putting it to cabinet. Similarly, for a future government, so say a future government wants to kill a project that a previous government had approved, okay, which is a frequent thing in our space, okay? They want to have a look at the technical study, and then they'll find ways that the technical study said, the business case of this project wasn't very good, therefore that's why we've killed it, and the previous government was disgraced that they, approved it based on this advice, etc. Right? And so it's a way of attacking.
There's a lot of money in doing reviews post-election,
right? But there's also it's also a way of protecting when you're kicked out of government. It's a way of protecting you in terms of disagreements and the decisions and things. So it's not if you've got a technical it is a difficult area, because of that particular risk. But my personal view is we should be a little bit more transparent than we are. Although I think freedom of information requests have become a problem in the sense that they often end up creating bureaucracy and worsening decision making as a consequence.
So going back to the issue of, how decisions are made, how do we deal with the ideological biases that experts are bringing to the table, and what can we do to improve the transport profession?
So the ideological biases is a real problem for decision makers. And I would argue that because overwhelmingly the advice that gets given comes from a centre-left perspective, it's particularly problematic for people in right-of-centre governments, right? Because all we have to do is look at the research around the vast majority of the politics of academia, for example. Overwhelmingly left of centre, like 90% plus in a lot of disciplines, right? So how can the values and the biases that these people have inevitably distorts what the research that comes out is and what it's about. I think that's similarly true when you look at public servants as well. I think public servants, the research on public servants is that they don't tend to vote centre-right generally, which is unsurprising because centre-right governments like to cut public services and reduce the number of public servants. So, turkeys don't vote for Christmas, public servants don't vote for centre-right governments who want to cut them back. So your advice is inevitably distorted because they come from a certain ideological perspective, which actually then weakens the government, the democracy in a sense, because you're not getting good quality advice that you can trust. That creates then for centre-right politicians a bind about what do I do because I can't get good advice based around the values that I have. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah. So what's the advice to transport professionals in order to make sure that there is an equal share of good advice? Because in all likelihood, most parts of the world swing between some form of centre-right versus some form of centre-left government. You do get outliers, and your definitions of centre-right and centre-left will vary depending on where you are. So if there's not expertise that is actually looking at transport as an entirety being fed to the side that's potentially in government 50% of the time, then what can we do? Is it framing? Is it training people who with those ideological leanings? What's the Russell King solution?
Well, one of the things I think we spend a lot of time is we want to have diversity in the public service, we want to have diversity in academia. The one thing that they don't focus on is diversity of thought. And that is a problem. It's a massive issue in research and academia, but I also think it's a significant problem in the public service as well, although a lesser problem than in academia. Okay, so I think one of the things here is you need to have diversity of thought. And I think one of the things about the public service is that historically it's tried to be apolitical, and it's done an okay job on that. I don't think that's sustainable anymore. One of the challenges we're going to have is we're going to be seeing governments not just from the centre left and the centre right, but from further left and further right across democracies. And I think a consequence of that is it become much more difficult for public services that have become less apolitical over time to be able to respond to the needs of those particular governments. And I think that is a massive challenge. I know that those populist parties what we call populist parties on the right are looking at how do they make the public service work for them when they know that most of the peer public servants will not be supportive of their agenda, and they're worried that they will be sabotaged as a consequence. And certainly when you look at the MAGA movement, one of their things is, they will talk a lot about the deep state and, why, they believe that they're being held back by the deep state as people that don't agree with their agenda are trying to sabotage it. And I think one of the challenges here is that the public services have become more value oriented around a particular value set rather than an apolitical set. And that value set has been, centre left generally. And I think that makes it very problematic. There is a confrontation coming between a centre left public service and a populist right movement. We've already seen that tension in the United States. I think it will become exacerbated over time, as I think we are going to see, certainly I think in the next 5 years, a whole number of quite right of centre governments compared to what we've seen historically coming to power. The thing I would say to transport professionals is, if you're in the public service, you need to be apolitical. That's the piece. When you're in that public service role, you have to be delivering for the government in an apolitical way. And if that doesn't fit your values, okay, then you should not be a public servant, and you should go and look and work elsewhere, to be frank, because that's the job, right? Your job is not to sabotage an agenda that you don't agree with. Okay. That's for, you can advise and say, I disagree, you disagree with the minister, and that's fine. Okay. But once the decision has been made, your job is to implement that as best of your ability, regardless of whether you agree with it or not. And if you can't live with that, then that's, sorry, then you're not in the right job.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note to end on, because certainly when I started out in the public service in the mid-1990s, one of the things that was inculcated into me by some quite left-leaning people was our job's to provide advice, and then once policy is made, implement that policy to the best of our ability.
Yeah.
Not to undermine it, not to second guess it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the public service has lost some of that. I think there's a lot of challenges with our public service. Trust between ministers and public servants has deteriorated for all sorts of reasons, right? And then that's resulting in poor advice, to be frank, because public servants are nervous about, getting shouted at, quite frankly. That's not what they want to be having done, right? And they don't want to be blamed and attacked by their ministers. And there's a lot of bad behaviour you're seeing because that trust has broken down from both sides.
All right, Russell. Well, thank you for another fun chat. I'm not sure if we continued to disagree or ended up agreeing in the end. We'll let the listeners and viewers decide that one. And if we did agree, who won? Let us know who won. Or I think more likely we just did what we always seem to do. We came to a common ground between us.
Yes. I think we both agree on sort of discussion and debate, and even if there's slight differences of opinions, is kind of like a broad agreement generally. It was great talking to you as always, Graham. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everybody, and please share, like, comment, donate if you get a chance.